My name is Atiaf El-Wazir. I'm the head of the Peace Program at the Quaker Council for European Affairs. We're an organization based in Brussels, where we've worked for the last 40 years to bring a vision based on the Quaker commitment to peace, justice, and equality to Europe and its institutions. This is a public event hosted by Quaker Council for European Affairs, Stop Fueling War, and the European Network Against the Arms Trade. Before I pass the floor to our two speakers, I want to go over a few housekeeping things. First of all, just as a reminder, this event is being recorded. And as you can tell, all participants are muted. So we kindly ask you to remain so during the event. And the event is supposed to last for 1 hour. I will begin by asking our speakers a few questions. And after that, we'll open the floor for Q&A from all of you. And finally, I'd like to invite you all to turn on your cameras. I see many faces already, if you're able to do so. Just to give us the feel that we're humans speaking to humans rather than machines speaking to machines. But of course, if you can't turn on your camera for any logistic purposes, if you don't have one, or if you have children behind you, as the case with me sometimes, and you'd rather not turn on the camera, that is also very understandable. So let us now begin. As the title of our event says, today we're going to discuss what it's like to advocate for disarmament and arms control in an increasingly militarized Europe. The founding of the EU was based on a vision of a peaceful, united, and prosperous Europe. And military matters were not part of the negotiations or the organizational structure of the European Union. But now we found ourselves 64 years later, we seem to have forgotten some of the lessons from World War II, and European militarism is unfortunately increasingly on the rise. And there's an alarming narrative in the EU that states that the EU added value is military assistance. And over the last decade, the EU budget is being increasingly used to finance arms-related activities under discreet and powerful lobbying of the arms industry. For example, since the launch of the European Defense Fund, the European Union has funded military research and development projects. And also, EU leaders have adopted the European Peace Facility, a €5 billion fund to train and equip security forces and militaries worldwide with lethal weapons under the EU flag. And yet, despite these alarming increase in militarism, the EU continues to be presented as uniquely value-based, and there is unfortunately very little self-criticism and responsibility for sometimes fueling conflicts worldwide. To tell us a little bit about how advocates and campaigners are working in this militarized environment, we're joined today by Laetitia Seydoux and Holly Spencer. I'll introduce them briefly, and then they will tell us a little bit more about their work. Laetitia is the EU Program Officer at ENAAT, the European Network Against Arms Trade. Since 2016, she's been monitoring the setting up of the EU Defense Fund, supporting military research and development for new or enhanced weaponry. She's advocating EU decision makers against diverting EU funds for weapon-related activities and raising awareness amongst media and the wider public. We're also joined by Holly, who's the project coordinator and founding member of Stop Fueling War, where she's been working for several years. She's been involved in campaigning against the arms trade since her days at university in 2011. And Holly also works for a UK-based peacebuilding organization and is passionate about changing the current security discourse and paradigm in the UK, France, and the EU. So let me begin with you, Laetitia. Can you please tell us a little bit more about your work at ENAAT?
Sure. Thank you, Atiaf, and thank you to all the organizations for this great event. I think that's pretty useful. I'll be very brief. You've said quite a lot already, I think, for people to gather a bit who we are. So the European Network Against Arms Trade is existing already since 1984. It's a group of peace organizations that gathered to work specifically on the European arms exports because they consider that the arms trade is a threat to peace, security, and development, and also with a specific focus on the role of the arms industry as a driving force behind those exports and behind military expenditure. It's very informal in the sense that we do not have any secretariat or permanent staff, except now for this specific EU project. And that's the specificity of the network. We have today 21 members. 18 of them are national groups from 14 European countries, so from Stop Fueling War to CAT in the UK. Some are very focused on arms export, others have a more wider peace mandate, and we have also more thematic or European or international groups like QCA. So as Atiaf said, since January 2016, we have this campaign that we call No EU Money for Arms, specifically focusing on this new funding of the EU dedicated to military research and development, which we call a specific niche because especially at the beginning, no other peace groups was really working on this. This was more presented as an industrial project. And that's, from our point of view, indeed more an example of the militarization of the EU, which would increase further arms exports, national military spending, and is happening under a strong influence of the arms industry. So as Atiaf said, just to conclude, we've been indeed focusing on advocacy and awareness raising. The conclusion of our 4 years of project now is that advocacy will work only together with awareness raising and together with pressure from a wider audience. So hence making the conversation today even more relevant for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laetitia, for telling us a little bit more about your very important work. Holly, I turn to you now. Can you tell us also a little bit about your work at Stop Fueling War, and also maybe a little bit about your recent publication, Good Answers to Difficult Questions?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you for organising this event. We're very grateful to be here. As Atiaf mentioned, my name is Holly and I'm a project coordinator for Stop Fueling War. And I've been involved in anti-arms trade activism for a while. So if you could go to the next slide, Clémence. So I'm going to answer who is Stop Fueling War, first of all. Stop Fueling War is a French association which was set up in 2017, whose aim is to raise awareness about the French arms trade and to campaign against its existence. And in particular, we focus a lot on the arms fair Eurosatory, which is based in Paris. And we build on 20 years of Quaker witness outside of Eurosatory. And we're supported by a group of European and French-based pacifist or anti-militarist groups. And as Laetitia mentioned, we're also a member of ENAAT. And our goal is to be able to transform the arms industry by redirecting resources focused on producing weapons and towards more peace building and conflict transformation, because the current system doesn't work, isn't keeping us safe, and is costing us a lot of money. So on to our publication. If you could go to the next slide, Clémence, thank you. What is Security? Rethinking Our Beliefs. So this is what we call the Good Answers to Difficult Questions. It's our most recent publication because we've had a lot of experience at Stop Fueling War about answering difficult questions or responding to challenges by people who think the complete opposite of us when it comes to the arms trade. And this comes from experience of talking to the media, talking to arms traders and military officials entering and leaving the Eurosatory arms fair. So we would get questions or statements thrown at us like weapons sales help to maintain peace, or non-violence is naive and unrealistic. So this is a collection basically of the most common challenges and questions we've been asked, as well as our answers to them. So I just want to show you very briefly where you can find it on our website in case you're interested. On the next slide. Thank you. So you go to our website, which is stopfuelingwar.org, and then you see the resources on the side menu. Click on the internal resources where you'll find both this and also briefing papers on particular subjects that we've produced, like the arms trade and COVID, the arms trade and climate change. So if you click on myths and answers there, you'll find this publication. And so that's it from me. You can use this publication however you want, in conversation with friends, family, colleagues, however you find, wherever you find yourself in conversations that maybe you want a bit more information to back up your argument.
Thank you very much, Holly. I think that documents can be very helpful for many people who are advocating and receiving some of these very difficult questions. And about these questions, I think I will ask both of you a little bit about your experiences. For example, you discussed the question of sometimes people perceive someone who is a pacifist as very naive or too idealistic. So I want to ask Laetitia, and then I'll turn to you, Holly. How do you deal with that in your conversations with policymakers? How do you respond to someone who tells you, for example, yes, we all wish that we can live in a world without arms, but that's just not realistic? How can you respond to something like that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's indeed many times the first reaction I would get once you start digging into the issue, even with policymakers, which I would thought they would be more open to different visions of the world. But it was even a game to see when they would come to a point to say, well, I am a pacifist too, but, you know, we need to be realistic, which to me sounds even like I'm not a racist, but. So it's, yeah, well, but then you're not. But anyway, so for them, at best, we are naive or idealistic. And for others, we are even ideologically biased, and they just even refuse to talk to us. The first response I would give to that usually was to say, well, yes, indeed, I'm idealistic. I have an ideal, I have a vision of the world that I want to fight for, and there is nothing wrong with that. Along that line, I think it's also good to remind, especially for policymakers, that it is thanks to idealist people that we have today democracy in Europe. The utopia or the ideal of yesterday has become a reality on a good number of issues, and especially in Europe. So I think here you can also use examples that could fit the case where you are, and most probably your interlocutor itself would not be in his or in her position, either for being a woman, either for having the wrong origin or sexual orientation, or being too poor to go to school, if this was not thanks to idealist people who wanted a different world. So I think that's something to remind to many people, because I think, and even if implementation may be still problematic regarding women's rights, for example, still this is not today an utopia. It's something you can fight for with rules and laws and legislations. And then the last point also is to wonder who is really the more naive. If you see the CPRI figures about military expenditure worldwide, they collect since 1988, so that's about 30 years. The world has spent over $40,000 billion in war, in military, weapons, armies, etc. So if the use of force, of weapons, if nuclear deterrence in particular, was a path to peace, then we should be at peace in the world for long, with so much money in it. And then also history demonstrated repeatedly in Europe that arms race is the safest path to war. And today we have a new global arms race. So I ask the question, who is more naive? To think that we need to find another path to peace, or to think that continuing doing more of the same, you would have a different result, which is still having wars. And maybe just to conclude, I also think that this kind of question is a good moment to clarify what pacifism is. Because most of the time, this answer also goes together with, yeah, I would also love throwing weapons and loving each other, but this is not how it works. Well, yes, pacifism is not about passivity. It is about resolving tensions and disagreements, because there will always be tension and disagreement among human beings, communities, states. But you decide to resolve that through peaceful means. And that's also, I think, something to be clarified.
Thank you very much. I think that is very well said and good reminder for everybody on how we can respond when we are asked such a question. And I do think that that this reminder that change, real change, we need to also push people to dream of a different system, or else that's how change has happened throughout the years. People allowed themselves to think of a different way and to dream that what is deemed impossible can actually become possible. So thank you for that reminder. Holly, would you like to add anything? Do you face similar issues or questions when you're talking to arms dealers or people at arms fairs?
Yes, thank you. Definitely, I agree with everything that Letitia just said. I like as well the point that you made about, who is actually being naive. I think that's great. I think for us, because we're often, when we're outside the arms fair and we're trying to have conversations with people or the media even, and we face quite a lot of anger sometimes because of our presence there. And I think what's important for us is finding common ground. And I think when I'm talking to people going into the arms fair, when any of us are talking to people going into the arms fair who most likely have very opposing views to our own, I think I like to talk about safety first and acknowledge that we're all fighting for the same thing. That is feeling safe and secure, and to know that the people we love are protected. And it's a lot easier to then have a conversation because they feel connected in some way to you and to your shared humanity. You have the same needs. Then it's easier to talk about where you differ. So for me, I need to keep in mind, that the people themselves are not necessarily the problem. It's the system within which they work. So empathy really is your greatest tool. But then, you have to keep in mind that empathy is very different from agreement. You can still disagree whilst being empathetic to what they think and what they're trying to do. And I think this is a problem that we're coming up against a lot in France and around the world, where people are increasingly polarized and the ability to find common ground becomes more difficult. And not to mention the huge spread of misinformation and fake news, and that all these things making it difficult to get to the heart of issues. But overall, I would say empathy is your biggest tool.
Thank you very much. You spoke about security and feeling safe. We are often conditioned these days to believe that war makes us safer, or needing more arms is a way to become safer. And I think the military-industrial complex is testimony to our constant preparedness for this unspecified war. How, in your opinion, can we maybe help remove this credibility or legitimacy of war and tell people there are other ways? How can we respond to that question?
Thank you, Atiaf. Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's increasingly a problem, and you mentioned earlier about nuclear powers such as France and the UK, spending billions to upgrade and renew their nuclear capabilities. And in France, the Minister of Armies, Florence Parly, has recently announced that the French military will be rearming. I didn't know they were unarmed, but they will be rearming and planning and training for a high intensity war, which is, particularly worrying that this is where they think they're headed. So to remove the credibility of war in the international arena as like the solution to problems, I think it's important to start by looking at the data and sharing the data. So the world, I think Letitia said this earlier, the world is not getting any safer, and we're spending huge amounts on weapons. And civilian deaths are a huge part of warfare these days as well. The proportion of civilian deaths has surged from about 5% at the beginning of the 20th century to more than 90% in more recent wars. So we should ask ourselves, whose security is the military-industrial complex supporting? And everything's done under a very secretive banner of national security. we need to ask ourselves, is the state thinking about also human security, the freedom from want and from fear? And I think for us, and this sort of links into to what we were talking about just now, the resistance to the use of force doesn't stem from optimism, but rather from a painful experience of centuries of violence that have led up to this point now, and the evidence that violence breeds more violence. So I think there will always be conflict that, if left unattended, can result in violence and war. However, there's an over-optimistic belief in what force can achieve, because non-violent action, according to a lot of research, is almost twice as likely as twice as likely as armed conflict to achieve positive change. So there is so much research done by organizations like Peace Direct, QCEA, of course, and Safer World, and lots of other organizations that demonstrate the effectiveness of what we call peace building. And there are so many great organizations working locally in conflict-prone situations as well, who are already doing the work that needs doing to build up their communities and protect their communities, and who do not get the funding or the recognition that they should. So that's problematic. And peace building approaches, however, do require effort and time, as well as knowledge and understanding of local culture. And the major problem is that profit and technology are now the real drivers of conflict, and the huge budgets have made the world increasingly unstable. To sort of sum up what I was saying, I don't think we have all of the answers, but there is a lot of research and a lot of stuff being done around the world that really is amazing, and the current research can offer a better understanding of what drives conflict, what are the real root causes of conflict, and how we can address them. And if peace builders had even just a small slice of those military budgets, then projects that have been proven to work for addressing conflict could be scaled up and better supported, and that would be great. But the disappointing truth is that these alternatives don't make people money very much, and do not prop up the current systems of government and industry or project power internationally.
Thank you very much, Holly. I would like to just remind everyone, for those of you who maybe came in after my introductory remarks, that I'm just asking introductory questions now to our two speakers, and afterwards we'll open the floor for questions and answers from you, or any comments you would like to share. So feel free to start writing in the chat if you would like me to call on you later to ask a question. Leticia, can I go back to you? And Holly mentioned a little bit about the secrecy or the secretive business of the arms trade, and this is a business that's not regulated. It's never been transparent in its dealings, and it's definitely not accountable for its crimes. And arms companies have not been subject to the same level of scrutiny, and usually hide behind governments. And even though it's sometimes possible to trace weapons used in attacks on civilians to specific companies. So I guess I want to ask you, how does this secrecy impact your advocacy work? And how can we ensure maybe a better level of accountability and transparency? It's a big question, but any insights you can have on this?
Yeah, it is quite big, but yeah, there are still some key points to try and focus on. So it's important indeed to remind, and I think even in conversations, that's something interesting to remind to your audience, is that the arms industry at large benefits from special treatments, escapes many rules of the normal business on transparency and accountability, as you say, but even on other elements like offsets, so giving compensations, public procurement, etc. So this problem of lack of transparency and accountability, to focus on this one, makes indeed our work more complicated, because then you happen to face positions which are rather based on assumptions about the advantages or the alleged positive impact of the arms industry. While there is no evidence of the latter, in the end, we are the ones we are asked to give proof of our own arguments. So it's always also good to reverse a bit the conversation and ask for the ones that you are discussing for to also bring proofs of their own elements. But we can also see, as you said, that even when there is clear evidence of misuse of European weapons in a specific area, it remains difficult to change the political decisions and the political frame. I think that changing that will require also a lot of pressure from public opinion. So it's very important to continue documenting the cases, working with investigative media to publish them, as it has been done by many peace groups. But it's also important to put quite a lot of energy to bridge the gap, to start to be also more visible in mainstream media and to trigger a larger public debate. So that includes working with parliamentarians through advocacy or lobbying, because national parliaments normally should play a key role. In countries where you have more of transparency and accountability, even if not perfect, are the ones where the parliament is more involved. So one of the important requests, I think, for civil society is to push their national parliaments to play this role, ask for playing this role. Another complementary option, which also seems to be useful, are to take legal cases when possible. You have successful cases in the UK, in Belgium, in Italy, in Germany, for example. So it's not always possible, but when it is, I think these are important tools to use also. Because the challenge is so big that it's necessary to combine different levels of action, from advocacy to awareness raising for the wider public and legal action. And then more broadly, it's important to counter all the myths about the alleged positive impact of the arms industry, from peace to economics and other elements. So publication like the one of Stop Fueling War Now is very important. I would also advise peace activists who want to go more into details and get figures and data that are very useful, which is to go to the book called Indefensible, the 7 myths that sustain the global arms trade. And I can provide a link to it. It's free online. It's quite easy to read, and it gives a lot of elements, arguments, figures, research, because they have really tried to collect the literature, especially in the US, but not only, to demonstrate with concrete elements why this sector is economically dysfunctional, so not bringing growth or jobs, but also a danger for peace and cannot bring peace. So that would be, I think there you can have elements to dig.
Thank you very much. And I'm wondering if we can post the links to some of these publications for everyone. Can I turn to Holly now? And Laetitia spoke a little bit about some of the other arguments, for example, the economic argument. And I want to bring this up. One argument that often comes up is that what's the alternative to war, and how can we deal with employees, for example, of the arms sector? The worry, of course, is that they would be out of jobs, for example, if there is no arms industry. So how can we counter that argument that ending arms trade will mean unemployment for thousands of people and their families?
Thank you, Atia. Yeah, this is a question that we come up against a lot in France, and I'm sure lots of other organizations come up against the same question. And I think, sort of following on from what Laetitia was saying earlier, it's very difficult for us to get accurate numbers on employment in the arms industry, which is, you know, linked to this sort of secrecy that surrounds the arms trade. And this, so this is due to several reasons. First and foremost, though, is actually the line between what is produced for civilian purposes and what is produced for military purposes is quite blurred. And things can be produced that are dual use, so could be used in society, but also be used by the military. And, you know, you can take into account things like surveillance technologies, or when you think about the aeronautics industry, that covers both warplanes as well as civilian aircraft. So the numbers are hard to get right. And then secondly, going back to what Letitia was saying, numbers on arms production or employment in the industry are not published by a lot of governments. If you take some of the larger arms producers in Europe, like France, it's estimated to be around 2 to 3% of the population, closer to 2% than 3%. But if you take a Europe-wide perspective, it's more likely less than that. And it's been well documented that the arms industry receives huge subsidies no matter where you are, and that can't really be justified by the current numbers in employment. So the success of the industry depends on these enormous government subsidies. They're basically essential for them to ensure sales and the export of weapons, and to carry out research into the development of new weapons and weapon systems. And not to mention as well, you know, spending lavish sums of money on entertainment and presents for potential buyers. And there's a lot of corruption and confusing things that happen in the arms industry. Also, not to mention as well, the lobbyists. So the arms industry finances professional lobbyists and expert advisors in this field, who are often also government ministers or former government ministers, sorry, not current, but and, you know, high-level public officials or retired army members. And so this always pushes for an expansion of the arms budget, and everything in the name of national security and job creation. And Campaign Against Arms Trade and other organizations have documented how it would be possible to transform some of these industries and jobs into renewable energy production. So that's one area where these jobs won't just disappear. There are a lot of these arms companies like Airbus, you know, are dual use as well. So there's some jobs that could go into renewable energy production, which arguably is much better for the world, and then a lot that you know, will be part of this dual use and could go towards civilian use. And I think the main reason given to us for the huge support of these industries by the government is, in France anyway, is they need to be able to produce these weapons for their own militaries, and then they export these weapons to pay for the production of the weapons for their militaries. So economically, it's an interesting argument. It doesn't. Yeah. So we come back to basically the same issues of what we consider makes us safe and secure, and you know, this issue of hard security and arms race and needing to be the best equipped, the most ready for war. So that doesn't really address the root causes of problems that threaten our security, or such as climate change, pandemics, as we've recently seen, or economic inequality.
Thank you very much, Holly. I think a lot of this has to do, like you said, with rethinking security and looking at the root causes. Laetitia, did you want to add or expand on anything Holly said?
Yeah, just very quickly to complement, it's interesting to see, you mentioned that the EU has started to fund military research and is dedicating more and more subsidies to the arms industry. It's interesting to see that in their figures, to justify that on basis of jobs and growth, they use the figures provided by the arms industry lobby group. They don't even have their own figures. So that's also quite interesting to see. So we don't really know whether these are all the direct jobs, indirect jobs, if this encompasses all the industry or not. And aeronautic, you also have the civilian parts. We don't know if they make the distinction with civil and military. So all that is very unclear. But still, even using their own figures, and we've done this comparison, at the scale of Europe, of the EU, it happens that the percentage of the jobs from the defense sector taking the official figures of the lobbyists is probably less than 1%. It's not that easy to compare the figures, as I said, but if you take the official figures from the EU about Eurostat, about employment, and the official ones from the industry, you realize that you are around 1% or maybe even less across Europe. So in the end, what happens is that this is mainly profiting to the big arms producers already, which have indeed a more important jobs into this area. So that's quite important. Another point, and then I would conclude with that, that about this argument of creating jobs, not only you could create more jobs in other sectors, but the jobs in the military research in particular might more shift jobs from the civilian to the military sector, because there is a lack of resources already in this area. And one of the arguments of the industry to ask for support is that they ask for funding to skill the workers, because they can't find the good workers. So they're going to shift in the way the workers from civilian areas to the military rather than creating new jobs.
Thank you very much. This has been very rich conversation. I have one last question, and then we'll open it to a Q&A, and we've already have quite a few questions. And this question is for either one of you. Today, the climate crisis is higher on the EU agenda than ever before, and the EU says it wants to become a global leader on sustainability, yet at the same time, it invests so much in carbon-intensive activities, such as the arms trade. And the EU Green Deal ignores everything that has to do with military impact on the climate. Does this come up in your conversations on disarmament, and how can we better connect the climate groups and groups working on disarmament issues? Either one of you would like to answer that?
Sure. If I can start, Letitia, is that okay? Thank you. Yeah, this is something that we've been thinking about a lot at Stop Fueling War. And it's funny you say, is it a conversation? Is it something that comes up in conversation? Not so much for us with people who are at the arms fairs, but with people who are activists in other areas, then yes, that does come up quite a lot. I think it would be really, really important to connect with climate activists, because it is really connected, and militaries are currently excluded from any international treaties on climate change, and the numbers are not generally published on how much pollution they're producing, despite being very large polluters. I also just quickly want to mention this strange greenwashing trend in arms production, where arms industries arms companies are producing green weapons, and I use quotes here, but they basically saying, oh yeah, use these are much better for the environment, which just blows my mind. But I think that we also need to be careful of not thinking about climate change as a security, well, climate change is a security issue, but we need to be wary of the securitization of responses to climate change. So we need to say, okay, yes, climate change is an issue, but that doesn't mean that you need to go and produce green weapons, and that doesn't mean that you need to go and develop more equipment that's going to be good in terms of flooding, or responding to any of these challenges that come with climate change. We need to actually look at system change, and what we're doing currently that's wrong.
Thank you, Holly. Laetitia, did you want to add?
Yes, briefly to complement. So speaking about the privilege of the arms industry, that's another one. So far, they escape the emission reduction targets. They don't have to comply with them. They don't have any targets. So that's also interesting to remind. The greenwashing is indeed an issue at European level. For example, they can access funding under environmental programs because of producing green weapons. That's an issue. There are recent studies about the impact of the arms sector on climate, so that's quite interesting. There are more and more resources about that. In the peace movement, there is a very growing interest to link climate change, the fight against climate change, and peace, because we definitely see that climate change risks very seriously to be addressed as a security problem from a hard security point of view. To bet roughly, Europe would more be preparing climate wars than really challenging the climate change per se. So that's indeed something we need to link, I think. And there are more and more examples now of cooperation, more in depth, but some networks which includes peace movements also. So that's definitely important to make the connection, I think, because that's also an important way to raise awareness among citizens of the link between those two elements. Climate is definitely an exacerbating factor of conflict on top of the other root causes.
Thank you very much. I will turn now to the questions and answers from the participants, and I'm going to ask them in the order that they arrived in the chat. So I want to invite Florence Bertoletti, if you want to ask the question yourself, or I can read it if you would like to ask it yourself.
Hello, everyone. I think the two questions are related. So in a nutshell, a lot of conflicts, I'm not talking about wars, but conflicts also against civilians. I noticed in the media that they always frame as religious, particularly against the dogmatic Islamists. But these groups of armed people who are killing civilians, who are making attacks, they get weapons. You see them on the media, they have huge cars and very stylized weapons. Why aren't we asking where these weapons come from? They've been bought, they've been helped. Where do they get their money? And I guess it's linked to geopolitics. But can you tell us a little bit more about these aspects, which are very rarely talked about? And to finish, my understanding is that the attack against the Charlie Hebdo, the weapons actually were manufactured in Europe or in France, which, you know.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would either of you like to take on that question? I guess the question is on the production and supply chain, maybe. And yes, Holly.
Yeah, sure. I think this is a very good question about where weapons end up and how they're used. It is very difficult to control once a weapon has been sold, what its end use is and where it ends up. Governments are always telling us how well regulated the arms industry and the arms trade is, but you know, people who are our allies today might be our enemies tomorrow, if we're talking about geopolitics. So, you know, and weapons don't tend to have much of an expiration date. I mean, they do renew them constantly and try and be better than everyone, but a weapon that was produced 20 years ago might still be working and being used and been sold on 5-10 times to other groups. So it is hard to control how and where they end up.
Thank you, Holly.
Yeah, I think this last point is an important one. I remember once in a radio broadcasting, a French responsible of the arms exports department in the French Ministry of Defense, I think, or economic, I don't remember. Anyway, was saying, well, in the end, we control at best 5 years of the lifetime of a weapon, so we know where they are, but after that, we completely lose track. So that's also important to remind about the idea of controlling arms exports. There are a lot of limits about that. It's quite tricky, and it needs to be very aware of all these elements about the arms exports. Diversion, combats, they get their weapons because through combats they win over another side, etc. I'm not an expert about Mozambique, but globally all those groups get a lot of their money through drug, oil traffic. So it's all this gray area of the economy is very much intertwined also with the arms exports.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Philip Chenery about also transparency of the arms trade. Would you like to ask it, Philip? I can't find
Thank you very much
Go ahead.
for your words so far. So you emphasize the issues of transparency when looking at the arms trade and the industry. And so I was wondering if Stop Fueling War collaborated with any open source organizations to achieve transparency on the arms trade specifically? And what role do you imagine open source having in the long term to tackle armed conflict? And for those, I guess, who don't know too much about open source, it is essentially accessible technology, such as geospatial technology. For example, Google Maps is probably a very classic example of this, or databases such as shipping databases or plane tracking websites, where really you can use this readily available technology to find out a lot of information. So yeah, thank you. That's my question.
Holly, go.
Thank you, Philip. That's a great question. I think there are a lot of great examples of how open source technology and open source software has been successfully used. And I know quite a few examples in peace building, like early warning systems, where it's like civilian early warning systems where people have access to a bunch of phone numbers, and if an incident happens somewhere, they can send out a warning and violence can then be prevented by these warning systems. And so there's some really, really great things happening. And I know peace and technology is something that is currently really in development, but we do need to catch up a little bit on the arms industry who've been developing their technology for years and years and years, and who are very good at that. So there is some catching up to do. But in terms of investigation and whether we currently do that, we are just developing our sort of investigative research skills. So not currently, but hopefully, yes, in the future.
And I think there are indeed a number of national peace groups, I think in Belgium, Advocacy in Spain, who are using a lot of these kind of tools to track ships, for example, and be able to track the movement of ships and deduce from all the different stops and etc. what type of weapons it may be carrying, etc. And then also take action in the harbor to try and stop the movement of the ships, or delivering or charging weapons. So I think there are more and more for activist groups who have some expertise on it to use this kind of tools.
Thank you very much. There is a question to Leticia from Alice Minnelli from the Quaker United Nations office. She's unable to ask it herself, so I'll ask it. I'll read it. She says, have you explored trying to hold arms manufacturers to account using the UN guiding principles on business and human rights? The UNGPs prescribe that businesses address the adverse human rights impacts of their activities or products.
Well, I haven't myself carried any legal case. It's mainly ENAAT members at national level who do it with their national courts. So I'm not 100% sure whether they use it, but I know it's a question that has been put on the table about when discussing about legal actions. This has been put on the table by a number of peace groups, that these principles might be a help, because so far the rules of what we call the common position at European level on arms exports are not necessarily accessible for legal cases, depending on the national context. So yeah, I'm not sure whether it has been directly used, but that's definitely now in the reflection.
Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone who has been sharing links to research databases or reports. And I encourage all of you, if you have anything to share, please don't hesitate to post it in the chat for everyone. We have a question from Tim and Wallace. Would you like to ask it? Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Well, thanks for all the excellent information, and I see that there are a lot of Quakers on this Zoom, and other people representing faith-based organizations. So I just wondered if you could say something about the moral pressure that you know, how much is it, are you using moral pressure, or trying to refer to core values of people in having those conversations about the arms trade and the militarization of the EU, because that's one of the tools that we have, and I just wondered if you could comment on that. Thanks.
Maybe I can comment on that. Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I think the moral argument is a strong one, because often what changes people's mind is emotion rather than fact. You can have, and this is somewhat frustrating to me, but you can have all of the most amazing facts and figures and evidence in the world, and sometimes it's not convincing enough unless there is a form of emotion or values or morals that you are also sharing. So that's very important. And I think for Quakers, you mentioned, well, Quakers have been campaigning against the arms trade for a long time in France and elsewhere, and it has been interesting to talk to people going into the arms fair who are of a certain faith background. Maybe they're Christian or of a different faith, and they will find it easier to talk to you potentially if you share about why you feel moved to do this, or why you feel that the moral argument is maybe more important than any other. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Can I follow up on this question? Sometimes within the peace movement or people advocating against war and disarmament, it's hard to convince people of the need to speak to people outside our view of our viewpoint. For example, I'm a firm believer that there are no good people / bad people. Everybody's sort of balancing the two. But sometimes it's very difficult to convince, let's say, some activists of the need, why we need to speak to arms traders, and why do we need to speak to people who we fundamentally disagree with. And I think you spoke about this, Holly, a bit earlier when you said empathy, that you try and use that. Can either of you expand on this? Is this something that you find difficult? Is this a challenge, or it's not?
Go ahead, Letitia. Sorry.
Sorry. No problem. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, most of the time, and I think that connects to the moral question. I think it's not that easy to raise this moral argument. I mean, it depends who you talk to. At European level, at least policymakers at EU level, that's not really something really clear. I would say quite the contrary. Unfortunately, most of the conservative groups, where you will find the German Christian Democrats, for example, are very much in favor of the militarization of the EU, of the defense fund, and so on. So I would say that it's true that I think indeed most people know this is not good, I mean, per se, but they are convinced that there is no other way. Be it for the jobs in countries like France or whatever, that comes, yes, but we need the jobs, yes, but then all these people would be unemployed, yes, but we have no other solution. So I would say they go together. I'm not sure you can convince someone solely on the ground of moral if he or she is not already taking that as his red line. I would say, like most of the peace groups, we take first our ethical or moral position, and from that we see how we can build a world differently. But if they are not already convinced about that, then you need to go deeper. And the question of empathy, about discussing with people you fundamentally disagree with, is important. I would be a bit more maybe provocative, I don't know, is that you need to consider your interlocutor as a victim, in a sense. I see them, so as I'm sure I'm not going to get a bit upset with them, keep my calm down, is to consider them as victims of a system. They are locked in a dominant way of thinking. And I think they just don't have the tools to think differently. And we need to be aware that we ask them to really get out of their comfort zone. It's something very painful. You are asking them to completely change their vision and the basis on which they are founded, their position on this question. So it needs time. It's something, and that's probably a difficulty. You usually, especially when you have an advocacy meeting with a policymaker, you don't have time. You have half an hour, they're already thinking about the next meeting. And that's something which is lacking under advocacy, is to have space for long discussions, for real deep debates, because otherwise there is no way. you discuss with relatives or friends. The only way, I think, as Holly said, is to find common grounds, not to be in a struggle with them that you are right and they are wrong in their vision of the world, because then you lose them, definitely. And yeah, and it takes a lot of time. But I think it's very important, I will conclude with that, is that because I use a quote, I just need to find it again because I like it, in a publication I just saw recently, where they were saying that the founding text of UNESCO says that since wars are born in the minds of people, it is in the minds of people that the bulwarks of peace must be erected. So yeah, it takes time, it's long, but we need to go really step by step, respect their feelings, but continue challenging them. Because as Oli said, we may have the same goal, but they don't see the same path.
Thank you very much. We have a question also from Lindsay, also from QNO. Lindsay, would you like to ask the question or should I read it? Trying to
That's
find...
fine. No, thank you. I mean, my question is also sometimes through the court cases, we had this in Britain with the abolition of slavery, sometimes a legal twist, putting the responsibility back on the owner or on those who benefit, actually has a huge impact that isn't initially appreciated. And I'm wondering, has there any been a successful attempt to bring an arms industry company to court to be liable for the death of a civilian who was killed by their arms? Thank you.
Laetitia,
Maybe one case which is going for long, which is quite interesting, is the case in Germany again, Heckler and Koch. So it's a German company who's been exporting weapons to Mexico, and they have, as far as I know, I'm not familiar with all the details, but from what I read, what I remember, they have been even hiding the real beneficiary of the weapons. So they knew they were going to export weapons to Chiapas, I think, and to areas where there was an arms embargo, and they deliberately modified the documents to hide this. And then they have been brought to court. The case has been long, of course, but so far, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, they had appealed and they lost their appeal. So the civil society who had been putting the case has won the case. I don't know whether they considered also the actual death of civilians due to their arms, but definitely they were trafficking weapons to a conflict zone, and they have been challenged for this responsibility in court. And I think they have fines to pay and elements like that.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I think I'll just take one last question and then we'll have to have the concluding remarks. Melanie Jameson, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. It seems to me that the ideal environment for the arms industry is to stoke enough paranoia to start an arms race. And so to achieve this aim, where the opportunities of selling weapons are going to be greatly increased, I just feel there must be disruption, sort of skullduggery, all sorts of things happening behind the scenes. And what I would love is to see this sort of exposed big time. So I'm just wondering who is having the wool pulled over their eyes? What are their techniques? How can we expose it? Because it seems to me a big expose might be a very useful thing. And this is, I say, this is making the underlying assumption that they must be trying to push things towards an arms race, because that is obviously their best, working environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Holly, would you like to?
Sure. I think, yeah, this is a very interesting point that you make. There is very much a culture of fear at the moment, and we're constantly bombarded with images of violence, of things that we should be worried about, things that we should be scared of. And I think often what bothers me about this is that whilst a lot of these things are terrible, and say if we talk about the risk of being a victim of terrorist attacks in a European country like France, you know, these things are terrible that happen, but the weight that we give to them is extremely high. So we develop weapon systems to be able to do counterterrorism or counter-violent extremism. We have huge surveillance of populations and the development of drones and armed drones and all of these things to counter terrorism, but we're not addressing necessarily the needs of people in general. So, you know, are we talking about safety, or are we talking about the sale of weapons and the development of more expensive and technologically advanced weaponry?
Thank you very much, Laetitia.
Yeah, maybe briefly to complement, I think that's what is also part of the picture is the very important over-influence of the military-industrial complex. They have a strong leverage of influence lobbying, starting from the national level, already starting with the fact that the state is their main client. They produce weapons for the army of their national country first. So there is really a very symbiotic relationship between the arms industry at national level and their governments. And you see the same level of influence at European levels. There is a report, if people want to dig into that, done by Fredus Axi about the role of the arms industry or on the development of this military funding. What I think also happens is that because they have been doing this lobbying for long and trying for long to get this funding, they started with security, kind of civilian dual use security research. What made it happen, I think, today is also indeed a kind of favorable context, I would say, around this fear discourse that Holly was mentioning. And also, I think the technological part plays an important role. There is this really strong tendency now to have kind of techno-fix solutions, that you would solution almost all kind of problem through technology. And I think that's also something that has favored a lot the arms industry, because you don't need technology for diplomacy, not much, I would say. So there is also a lot of this kind of vicious circle about we need technological superiority. So part of the arms race is also a technological race to maintain the hegemony of the current economic or West-driven economic system, which relies a lot on this technological superiority over the rest of the world. And that's also part of the picture, which makes indeed, unfortunately, an atmosphere which is very favorable to the arms industry.
Well, thank you both very, very much. I want to tell Phoebe, Stockport, if you want to contact Laetitia and Holly via email, apologies, we couldn't get to your question. We are already out of time, but if you can both give us in 1 minute a concluding remarks and maybe just to try and end on a positive or hopeful note, despite this very difficult subject, is how can we keep hope alive? Are there any points of for opportunities that you see? Oh, Holly, would you like to start?
Sorry. Yes, thank you. I think that's a great question. There are many reasons to hope. And I just quickly wanted to mention, I saw someone posted in the chat about the conflict armament research, because there have been quite a few questions about how you trace weapons, and they do some really great research on tracing and where weapons end up. So just to mention that quickly. But yeah, there are some reasons to hope. And there is a growing network of organizations like the ones here today, and like a lot of the things mentioned in the comments, and many others who have not been mentioned, who are all working towards the same or similar goals and are arguing for a shift in policy away from hard security and towards more effective peace building and other methods of change. And I think the pandemic has really shone a light on what makes us safe, and how safety is so much broader than military or national security. So there's an opportunity there. And I think overall, my current perception is that more and more people see that military responses are not solving our problems, and the more backed up by evidence the peace building sector or the anti-arms trade sector becomes, the harder we are to argue with. So yeah, that's the aim. We're going to be very difficult to argue with very, very soon.
Thank you very much.
Yes, indeed, as Holly, I still have hope, and that's why we are here, I think, all of us. And yes, there is always hope until it's too late anyway. So until we are not at war, then there is still hope, I think. And as Holly, I see also a certain movement. I think there are, for example, more and more investigative media which are digging into the arms exports, who are revealing cases. There are more and more cooperation with this kind of media, with the open source. So I think that's really an interesting move. We are not yet at the stage of the wider mainstream media, but this will come, I think, also thanks to the work we carry out. The peace movement is still quite small, I think, in most of European countries. So this also means we have a large room of maneuver to try and raise awareness among citizens about this issue. There is really here a good reservoir, I think, of people who could get convinced. And also, I think the link with the climate issue is also an important opportunity to show how those two issues are closely interrelated, not only because the arms industry per se contributes to climate change, but also because of what kind of future we want to have. There are many peace groups to join, campaigns going on. We must not be afraid to be vocal, I think, even though we may appear naive or whatever, which maybe is also something that many times people have been a bit afraid of being not considered for that reason.
Thank you very much. For me, both of you providing me a sense of hope, as well as everyone here today. So that's my hope, my sense of hope. So thank you very much for this very informative and rich discussion. I truly enjoyed it, and I hope you did as well. And I hope we can all keep in touch. Hope you have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for coming.